Today I'm going to show you how to make mitered corners on borders. I only miter when I am using a directional pattern such as a stripe or printed border fabric. Otherwise there's really no point because the seams are not noticeable. In this example, I am applying borders to a block to be used in a larger quilt. If you are mitering borders on a larger quilt, the principles are the same. You will want to do one border at a time, measuring carefully as I explain in another one of my videos on how to apply borders, and use a lot of pins. But because this is a small block, I will be doing all 4 borders at the same time. Now the first thing we'll have to do is a little bit of basic math, but don't worry, it's just adding and subtracting. So you'll need to measure your quilt. In this example, my block is 9.5 inches unfinished, which means it'll be 9 inches finished after both 1/4 inch seam allowances are used to add on the borders. My block is square, so the measurements are the same. However, if your quilt is a rectangle, you will want to measure carefully in both directions. Next, determine how wide you want your border. I want mine to be 1.5 inches finished, so I have already cut these at 2 inches. The length is determined by adding the finished length of your quilt, or in my case the block, plus the width of 2 borders minus 1/2 inch for the 2/4 inch seam allowances. In this example then, the finished block is 9 plus 4 equals 13 minus 1/2 equals 12.5 inches. This is the minimum amount of fabric that I need for my borders. You can always make them a bit longer and trim the excess off later. I have cut my borders so all the stripes are the same. However, this is a wonky stripe, so they are different at both ends, and I have to make sure that the matching ends are together. See, as you can see, those are matching up there, and then down at the bottom they are also matching. So I have them all lined up properly. Next, we need to find the center of the block, or in your case maybe perhaps your quilt, and you can always measure with a tape measure and find the center. But here I'm just going to finger press the center on both edges, actually all 4 edges. I just started with the top and the bottom. And then as you can see the folds there, then I'm going to do the same thing with the borders. I'm going to fold them in half and do a finger press and make sure that I've laid them the same way I had them out so I'm not messing up my 2 ends. And then fold it down right sides together, lining up the finger pressed edge there. And then I'll take a pin and secure it with a pin. Then I will repeat that with the bottom border. Fold it in half, finger press, open it up, and then lay it right side, and again secure it with a pin. Then I will repeat that same procedure on the other 2 sides by finger pressing, finding the center by finger pressing and securing the borders on both of those sides. Now at the sewing machine, I recommend that you use a 1/4 inch foot to sew all your seams, and on my particular one, mine is notched and it has a 1/4 inch notch at the needle, in front of the needle, and behind the needle, which will really help in you sewing these seams on properly. Next, you'll want to position your project so the quilt or block is on top with the border underneath so that you can see the edge of the quilt. You'll want to line that up with that 1/4 inch notch behind, or if you need to measure, you want the needle to be starting a 1/4 inch from that edge. I recommend that you do a couple stitches and then back stitch so that secures that corner. Then go ahead and sew all the way down to the other edge, and when you approach that other edge you want to stop a 1/4 inch from it. So if you have those notches, you can line that up so that you stop your needle at that 1/4 inch from that edge. And again, back stitch to secure that corner, and then go ahead and break the thread. Then turn the quilt to the next edge, folding back the border you just attached so that you can clearly see where you stopped the stitching. You will then lower your needle at where you stopped the stitching and from the last seam and start the next side down at that point. So make sure that the needle goes right in next to it, not on top of it. Take a couple of stitches and forward and then a couple of back to secure that corner, making sure you don't go back into the seam. But that secures those corners if you do it like that. Then you will continue around and do all of the corners like that, and I will come back to you when we get to the final corner. So here we are at the last border, and as you approach where you started, you want to go real slow and put your needle right next to where you started that first seam, and then take a back stitch to secure it, and then clip your threads. If you did go into any of those seams, you will find that your corners will not lay flat. You can always pick them out and restitch those few stitches. Now we will mark the corners in preparation of sewing them. You'll need some kind of a marker. It doesn't matter what it is. And then a ruler that has a 45-degree angle line on it. So take your block or a quilt with the 4 corners and fold it in half diagonally so you line up the 2 borders that are next to each other on top of each other, right sides together, and line up those raw edges. And you do want to be a bit precise because this is what's going to give you that exact 45-degree angled mitered corner. So line your 45-degree line along the raw edge of the border. The other edge of the ruler will be right against the folded block or quilt, and then the corner of the block will be, of the border will be where your ruler comes. Then mark it from where you stitched out to the corner. Now if you made your borders longer than the exact length, it's okay, just mark that 45-degree angle. Once you've done that, place a pin in it and then continue to do that with all 4 corners. Now back at the sewing machine, you're ready to sew the mitered corners. Again, line up the needle very carefully at the next to the very last stitch you did on the corner before, and take a couple of stitches forward and a couple of back. Again, making sure you don't go back into those seams, and then sew out to the end of that line, or in this case, the corner. Again, if you made your borders longer than the exact, you'll just follow that line out because you've drawn a perfect 45-degree angle, and so you just sew that out and we'll trim later. Continue to do that with all 4 corners, and then we'll finish up. Here's a corner that I took a stitch into the seams, and so it is not laying flat. So the way to fix that is to take out the couple of stitches that went back into the seam until it's no longer catching, and then you're going to re-sew it by simply folding again, being very careful to get everything folded back out of the way, and then place your needle right next to the end of that seam and then just restitch those couple of stitches. And then you can see how much flatter that lays. Now take your project to the ironing board, and the first thing we're going to do is trim. And you could use a rotary cutter, but I prefer to just use scissors and eyeball a really fat 1/4 of a seam. Don't make it less than 1/4 of an inch. Make it 1/4 to maybe perhaps even 3/8, because we are going to press these seams open, and they lay much flatter if the seam is a little bit larger. The seam allowance is a little bit larger than 1/4 of an inch. So once you've trimmed all 4 corners, then we're going to press open the seams. By doing this, the corners will be really flat and very square. So it's worth the time to do this step. So first you want to press each of the 4 corners, or if you're working on a big quilt, you can do one at a time. But since I'm working on the small block, I'm just going to go ahead and press all 4 corners open first. And then once I've opened up all the corners, then we're going to press the rest of the border seams. So I like to press so that the block is pressed towards the border. I think it looks nice and it'll lay flatter than if you press it that way. So when you come to the corner there, you just want to press back the little bit of border fabric onto that open corner seam. Continue to press until you have all 4 sides pressed towards the borders. Once you've finished pressing on the back side, you'll want to flip it over, and we're going to press once again on the front side. The reason for that is sometimes when you press from the back, you don't get the seams completely open. I found just a couple little areas that weren't completely pressed open, so you can take the edge of your iron and make sure that the border gets pressed all the way open, and you've got a nice flat seam. So here's our completed block, or in your case perhaps a quilt, and you can see how the corners are nicely mitered. The stripes are lining up to each other, and it's laying nice and flat, and the borders are completely 90 degrees. The angle is a perfect 45-degree angle with no pulling or tugging, and the block is square. So I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching.